welcome to another deep dive. And this one, well, this one might make you go, huh, really? We're going to be talking about infections and infertility.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, those two things might not seem connected at first, but there's some pretty interesting research out there on how things like Candida species and bacterial infections
Yeah,
can,
yeah.
can affect both men and women when it comes to, well, making babies.
Yeah.
And I bet some of you are thinking, wait, isn't Candida just like a yeast infection? Like, what's the big deal?
Mm.
But we're going to go a little deeper than that.
It's true.
It turns out there's a lot more to the story, and we've got a lot of fascinating insights to share with you today. So are you ready to dive into this microscopic world of love and maybe the microbes that might be getting in the way?
I am. I think it's an area that's often overlooked, when couples are struggling to conceive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the World Health Organization, they actually define infertility as the inability to conceive after 12 months of regular, unprotected sex. And it affects millions of people globally.
Wow.
So, and sometimes the cause just remains a total mystery, but today we're gonna shine a light on one potential culprit. Infections. And let's start with, the usual suspects.
Right.
Bacteria.
Okay, yeah. So bacteria like chlamydia and gonorrhea, these are known to, cause some serious problems in the female reproductive system. And these infections, they can actually trigger something called pelvic inflammatory disease. That's PID.
Right.
And that can actually damage the fallopian tubes.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
And that can lead to blockages, making it really difficult for an egg to travel to the uterus.
This is basically like creating a roadblock on the path to
Yeah,
pregnancy.
exactly, a roadblock.
Wow.
But it's not just about the fallopian tubes. Bacteria can also directly interact with sperm, causing them to clump together, which is a process called agglutination. So imagine, like a bunch of swimmers all tangled up. It's going to be a lot harder for them to reach their destination, which is, in this case, the egg.
Yeah. It's like a microscopic traffic jam.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Okay. But here's where things get really interesting, I think. Candida. We often associate it with, those yeast infections,
Right.
but it turns out it might have a more sinister role, maybe in infertility as well.
Yeah, so what's really fascinating about Candida albicans in particular is its resilience, like its ability to survive.
Yeah.
It has this incredible ability to stick to tissues, form these protective biofilms. Imagine like a microscopic fortress.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it can even, invade different organs. And these biofilms, these are particularly problematic because they act as this shield, and makes it harder for the body's defenses and even antifungal medications to reach the candida. It can essentially just like hide out, making it harder to eliminate and potentially causing more inflammation in the process.
So how does this tiny little yeast actually contribute to infertility?
So research has shown that that Candida albicans can actually bind directly to sperm. And this can actually decrease their viability, potentially even inhibiting fertilization. So it's almost like, it's hitching a ride, but not in a helpful way.
That's a disturbing image.
Yeah, it's not great.
It kind of makes you wonder, how significant a role Candida is playing in infertility, especially considering, yeast infections are so common.
Yeah.
And speaking of, hidden threats, we had this Sardinia study here, and it really brought home, I think, how common these infections can be in couples who are struggling to conceive.
Right.
So this study actually found that 20%,
Mm-hmm.
20% of the infertile women and 14% of the infertile men, they actually had a urogenital infection.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a significant number.
Yeah, definitely.
And it really kind of highlights, I think, the importance of considering infection as a potential cause before exploring more complex fertility treatments.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the bacteria they identified in the Sardinia study, like E. coli, Enterococcus, and ureaplasma, these have been linked to infertility in other research as well.
So it seems like, maybe a simple course of antibiotics could be the answer for some couples,
Right.
but of course it's not always that simple, right?
Yeah.
What are some other ways that these infections might be, disrupting this delicate balance of the reproductive system?
Well, one key factor is inflammation. When our reproductive systems are infected, they launch an inflammatory response to fight off the invaders. It's like sending in the troops, but sometimes the battle itself can actually cause damage to the surrounding area.
So it's kind of like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, exactly.
The inflammation is necessary to, combat the infection,
Right.
but it can also harm these delicate tissues.
In the process.
Yeah. For instance, in women, chronic inflammation in the fallopian tubes, this is often caused by infections like chlamydia, and it can actually lead to scarring and blockages.
Yeah.
So imagine like a smooth, open pathway becoming narrow and constricted. It makes it much harder for the egg to travel through.
And I imagine inflammation can cause problems for men as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Mm.
In the male reproductive tract, inflammation can disrupt sperm production, their ability to swim effectively, and even their shape, which are all, of course, crucial for fertilization.
Wow. So in both men and women, this inflammation that's triggered by infections, it can just create this less than ideal environment for conception. It's almost like trying to plant a seed in scorched earth.
That's a great analogy.
But but inflammation isn't the only weapon these microbes have, right?
You're right, yeah. So some bacteria, like E. coli, they release these toxins that can directly damage sperm cells. So think of them as like tiny microbial grenades being launched at the sperm.
It's like a microscopic war zone down there. It is.
Wow. And what about Candida?
Yeah.
How does it wreak havoc beyond just clinging to sperm?
No, well, those biofilms we talked about earlier, those play a significant role. Candida is a master at creating these protective barriers, that make it very difficult for our immune system and antifungal medications to penetrate. So it's not just hiding out, it's actively defending itself, potentially releasing inflammatory substances that further disrupt the delicate balance of the reproductive environment.
It's amazing how much is going on at a level that we can't even see.
It is. Yeah.
But if these infections are so prevalent and, potentially damaging to fertility, why don't we hear more about them? Why aren't they routinely screened for?
That's a great question. I think one reason is that the symptoms of these infections, particularly in men, they can be, very subtle or even non-existent. So, someone could have an infection and not even know it, allowing it to linger and potentially impact their fertility without them ever realizing it.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah,
It seems like regular testing would be, crucial, especially for people who are planning to start a family. Like early detection could make all the difference.
I completely agree. Yeah. Addressing these infections early on, it could be a game changer for many couples who are struggling to conceive.
And this brings us to another important point, antibiotics.
Mhm.
You know, they're often the first line of defense
Right.
against bacterial infections. But we have this rise of antibiotic resistance, which is a
Yeah.
growing concern. So if these infections become harder to treat, I mean, their impact on fertility could become even more significant.
Absolutely. Yeah. It highlights the urgent need for, responsible antibiotic use
Yeah.
and the development of, new treatment strategies to combat these evolving microbial threats. But even if we can effectively treat the infection, there's another layer of complexity to consider,
No.
our own immune system.
So you're saying our own bodies could be working against us
In a way.
in this battle for fertility.
Yeah. So when our immune system encounters an infection, it releases these antibodies to fight it off. That's the normal healthy response.
Right.
But sometimes those antibodies, in their zeal to protect us, they can mistakenly target not just the infectious agent, but also our own reproductive cells.
You mean so our own antibodies could be attacking our sperm or eggs?
Yeah. It's a complex phenomenon, but it has been observed in some cases of infertility. For example, there's evidence suggesting that antibodies that are produced in response to chlamydia infection, they can sometimes bind to sperm and impair their function. So it's like friendly fire in the reproductive system,
Oh, wow.
with our own immune system hindering our ability to conceive.
That is mind-blowing. It really underscores how intricate and delicate the balance within our bodies is,
Yeah.
and how even seemingly straightforward infections can have these unforeseen consequences.
Yeah. It's a reminder that infertility isn't always a simple issue with a straightforward solution. It's often a multifaceted problem, influenced by genetics, lifestyle, environmental exposures, and as we've seen, infections and the immune response to them.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From, those
I think it's been a really valuable overview and it's a good reminder that something that might seem, minor, like a yeast infection or a bacterial infection, it can actually have pretty far-reaching consequences for people that are hoping to start a family.
absolutely, and it really underscores the importance of awareness, testing and early treatment. So if you're
Mm.
thinking about starting a family, or even if you're just curious about this fascinating subject, talk to your healthcare provider and stay informed.
Really is, yeah. It's a lot to think about. And, it's clear that infections can really have a big impact on fertility. And
Right.
then you throw in, antibiotic resistance, which is becoming more and more of a problem.
Yeah,
This is something that could become even more challenging to deal with in the future.
absolutely. And it feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this topic today.
Oh, for sure.
There's so much more to explore and understand about this whole intricate interplay between infections and infertility.
Definitely. I mean, but I think we've given a pretty good overview for our listeners today.
For sure.
And it's a good reminder that something that might seem, like not a big deal, like a yeast infection or a bacterial infection,
Right.
can have, huge consequences for someone who's trying to start a family.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really does underscore the importance of awareness and testing and early treatment.
Mm.
So if you're, thinking about starting a family, or even if you're just curious about this whole, fascinating subject, definitely talk to your healthcare provider and stay informed. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the microscopic world of love and the microbes that might be getting in the way of it. Until next time, stay curious.